The spotlight hit Sammy Davis Jr. as he spun across the stage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, March 1961. The Copa Room was electric, 2,000 people on their feet, clapping to the rhythm as Sammy sang and danced with an energy that seemed superhuman. He was in the middle of I've Gotta Be Me, pouring everything into every note, every step. Sweat glistened on his face. His smile was brilliant. This was Sammy at his absolute best. And then a voice cut through the music. Loud, ugly, deliberate. Get off the stage, and not. The word hung in the air like poison. Sammy stopped mid-step. The smile vanished from his face. The orchestra faltered, notes trailing off into confused silence. 2,000 people froze. Some gasped. Others looked away, embarrassed, ashamed. But everyone heard it. Everyone knew what had just happened. Sammy stood alone at center stage, the spotlight still on him, exposing his pain for everyone to see. His hands trembled slightly. His one good eye searched the darkness beyond the lights, trying to find the source of the hatred. For a moment, he looked small, vulnerable, like all the talent in the world couldn't protect him from that single word. From the wings, Frank Sinatra set down his drink. His face, which seconds before had been relaxed and smiling, went cold. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked onto the stage with the calm, measured steps of a man who'd made a decision, and everyone in that room knew that what happened next would define not just the evening, but something much larger. This is the story of that night. But to understand what Frank Sinatra did and why it mattered so much, you need to understand what it meant to be Sammy Davis Jr. in 1961. You need to understand the cruelty of a world that loved watching him perform but refused to see him as human. And you need to understand the bond between three men who decided that friendship was more important than the comfort of staying silent. Sammy Davis Jr. was born in Harlem in 1925. By the age of 3, he was on stage with his father and his uncle in an act called the Will Maston Trio. Sammy didn't have a childhood in any normal sense. He had stages, dressing rooms, audiences. From the time he could walk, Sammy was performing, learning that his value came from how well he could entertain people. And Sammy could entertain. He could sing, dance, do impressions, play multiple instruments. By the time he was 7 years old, Sammy was being called a prodigy. But his father taught him something early on. Son, you have to be twice as good as the white performers, not just as good, twice as good, because they'll always have an excuse to pass you by, so you can't give them one. Sammy took that lesson to heart. He worked harder than anyone. He practiced until his feet bled. He studied every performer he could find, learning their techniques, absorbing their styles. By his 20s, Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most talented entertainers in America, and almost nobody knew it, because Sammy was black, and in the 1950s and early 1960s, that meant talent only got you so far. Sammy could perform in the biggest venues in Las Vegas. He could fill rooms, make audiences scream with delight, but when the show ended, Sammy had to leave through the back door. He couldn't stay in the hotels where he performed, couldn't eat in the restaurants, couldn't swim in the pools, or walk through the front entrance. In 1954, Sammy's life nearly ended. He was in a car accident that destroyed his left eye. Doctors said his career was over. Hollywood wrote him off, but Sammy got a glass eye and went right back on stage, and somehow he was better than before. The accident had given him something, not just determination, but a kind of defiance. A refusal to let the world tell him what he couldn't do. Frank Sinatra first saw Sammy perform in 1947 at a small club in Los Angeles. Frank was already a star. Sammy was just a kid in a trio, working small venues, trying to get noticed. But Frank watched Sammy move across that stage and saw something extraordinary, pure talent, unfiltered joy, the kind of performer who could make you forget everything else and just feel. After the show, Frank went backstage. Sammy couldn't believe it. Frank Sinatra, his idol, was standing in his dressing room. "Kid, you're something special," Frank said. Sammy, barely able to speak, stammered, "Thank you, Mr. Sinatra. That means everything. Call me Frank. And remember this, you've got more talent than most people will ever have. Don't let anyone tell you different." That moment stayed with Sammy for the rest of his life, because Frank didn't just compliment him. Frank saw him, really saw him, not as a novelty or a curiosity, but as an artist, as an equal. Over the next decade, Frank and Sammy's paths crossed occasionally. Frank would always stop to talk, to ask how Sammy was doing, to encourage him, and in 1959, when Frank was putting together regular performances at the Sands with Dean Martin, he made a decision that shocked Las Vegas. He wanted Sammy Davis Jr. to join them. The Sands management was nervous. "Frank, you know the situation. Sammy's talented, but having him as a regular, that's going to cause problems." Frank's response was simple: "Then we'll deal with the problems. Sammy performs with us, and he stays in this hotel, in a suite, just like Dean and me. If you can't handle that, I'll find another hotel." The Sands couldn't afford to lose Frank Sinatra, so they agreed. When Sammy arrived at the Sands for his first performance with the Rat Pack, Frank personally walked him through the front entrance, past the stairs, past the whispers, right up to the front desk. "This is Sammy Davis Jr., Frank told the clerk. "He's performing with us. Give him one of the best suites you have." Sammy felt something he'd never felt before in Las Vegas: dignity. The simple dignity of walking through a front door like a human being. Dean Martin had his own reservations initially, not about Sammy's talent. Dean recognized that immediately. But Dean knew Las Vegas. He knew the attitudes. He pulled Frank aside before that first show. "Frank, you know what you're doing is going to make waves. Let them make waves, Dean. Sammy deserves to be here." Dean looked at Frank, then nodded slowly. "All right, then we do it together." And they did. The three of them, Frank, Dean, and Sammy, created something that Las Vegas had never seen: a show that was spontaneous, hilarious, and built on genuine friendship. Audiences loved it, but more importantly, Frank and Dean made it clear that Sammy wasn't a guest. He was family. By March 1961, the Rat Pack had been performing together for over a year. They developed a rhythm. Frank would sing his ballads. Dean would wander on stage with his drink and make everyone laugh. Sammy would explode with energy, dancing and singing, and doing impressions. It was magic. But beneath the magic, Sammy still felt the weight of being different. He heard the comments, saw the looks. There were people who came to the shows specifically to see Frank and Dean, and who tolerated Sammy. And there were others who came looking for a reason to express their hatred. The night of March 15, 1961, started like any other Rat Pack show. Backstage before the performance, the three of them were loose, joking around. Dean poured himself a drink. "Sammy, you ready to kill them tonight?" Sammy grinned. "Born ready, baby." Frank adjusted his tie in the mirror. "Just don't upstage me too much out there." Sammy winked. "No promises, Chairman." They walked on stage together, and the crowd erupted. This was what people came for: the chemistry, the fun, the sense that anything could happen. Frank opened with "The best is yet to come." The audience swayed. Dean wandered on halfway through and made a joke about Frank's hairpiece. Frank shot back. The crowd laughed. Then it was Sammy's turn. Sammy took the microphone and launched into "I've Gotta Be Me." It was his signature song, an anthem of self-determination and pride. Sammy poured himself into it, dancing across the stage, his energy infectious. People were on their feet, clapping along. This was Sammy at his peak, untouchable. He was halfway through the second verse when the shout came from the darkness:
"Get off the stage and that!"
Time seemed to stop. Sammy's voice caught. The band kept playing for a few more notes before the conductor, realizing something was wrong, cut them off. The silence that followed was crushing. Sammy stood frozen in the spotlight. His face, which moments before had been alight with joy, crumpled. You could see it happen. The pain, the shame, the horrible familiarity of that word, that hatred, cutting through everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, reducing him to something less than human. 2,000 people sat in stunned silence. Some looked down at their tables, unable to meet Sammy's eyes. Others stared, waiting to see what would happen. A few whispered to each other, shocked, uncomfortable. Dean Martin, standing in the wings, started forward immediately. He reached Sammy in seconds and put his hand on Sammy's shoulder. "I got you, Sam," Dean said quietly. Sammy couldn't speak. He just stood there, trembling. Frank Sinatra was standing at the side of the stage. He'd been watching Sammy's performance with a drink in his hand, smiling. The smile was gone now. His face had gone cold. Not angry yet, just cold, calculating. He set down his glass with deliberate care and walked onto the stage. The audience watched Frank cross the stage and stop at the edge, looking out into the darkness. Who said that? Frank's voice was quiet, controlled. "Stand up. Let everyone see you. There was movement near the back. A table of 4 men, clearly drunk, clearly belligerent. One of them stood up, swaying slightly. I did, and I'll say it again. This is a white man's show. He doesn't belong here. Frank nodded slowly. Then he stepped off the stage and walked directly toward the man's table. Security moved to intercept, but Frank waved them off. I got this. The room was silent, everyone watching. Frank stopped in front of the man's table and looked at him, really looked at him. The man, emboldened by alcohol and the support of his friends, tried to stare back, but Frank's gaze was steady, unblinking, and there was something in it that made even drunk courage falter. When Frank spoke, his voice was low, but it carried through the entire room. You see that man on stage? His name is Sammy Davis Jr. He's the most talented performer you'll ever see in your miserable life. He can sing better than you, dance better than you. He's funnier, smarter, and worth 100 of you. And he's my brother, not by blood, by choice, which means more. Frank paused, letting that sink in. Then he continued. Now you have 2 options. You can stand up, walk out of this room quietly, and never come back to the sands, or security will escort you out. Either way, you're leaving. You have 10 seconds to decide. The man looked around, suddenly less certain. His friends were silent now, unwilling to back him up. Frank didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, waiting. 5 seconds passed. The man tried to muster defiance. You can't throw me out. I paid for my seat. 7 seconds, Frank said calmly. The man looked at Frank's face and saw something that made him understand this wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a performance. Frank Sinatra meant every word. Fine, the man muttered. This place is a dump anyway. He grabbed his jacket and started toward the exit, his friends trailing behind him, heads down. As they left, Frank turned to face the room. Every eye was on him. He walked back to the stage, picked up a microphone, and his voice, when he spoke, was clear and firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't tolerate that kind of poison here. This is the Sands Hotel, and at the Sands, we judge people by one thing, talent. And the man you just heard doesn't have any. But Sammy here? Frank gestured to Sammy, who was still standing with Dean, tears in his eyes. Sammy has more talent in his little finger than most people have in their entire body, so let's show him what we really think. Frank started clapping, slowly at first. Then Dean joined in, and then the entire room erupted. 2,000 people on their feet, applauding, cheering, drowning out the hatred with love. Sammy stood there, overwhelmed, as the ovation washed over him. Frank walked over and put his arm around Sammy. You okay, Sam? Sammy nodded, unable to speak. Then let's finish this show. The rest of the performance was electric. Frank, Dean, and Sammy performed with an intensity that came from something deeper than entertainment. They were making a statement that friendship mattered, that talent mattered, that human dignity mattered more than prejudice. After the show, backstage, Sammy sat alone in his dressing room. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him exhausted and raw. There was a knock at the door. Frank walked in. You all right, Sam? Sammy looked up. Frank, I'm sorry. I ruined the show. Frank sat down beside him. You didn't ruin anything. That idiot did, and he's gone. You're still here. It never stops, Frank. Sammy's voice cracked. No matter how good I am, no matter how hard I work, to some people I'll always be. Don't. Frank cut him off. Don't give that fool that power. You know who you are. We know who you are. And after tonight, everyone in that room knows. They saw you perform. They saw how talented you are. And they saw what happens when someone tries to tear you down. We don't let it stand. Dean Martin appeared in the doorway. Sam, you okay? Yeah, Sammy said, wiping his eyes. Thanks to you guys. Dean walked in and sat on Sammy's other side. That's what family does, Sam. We protect each other. Frank put his hand on Sammy's shoulder. Listen to me, Sammy. You belong on that stage, not because Dean and I let you, because you earned it. Your talent earned it. Your heart earned it. Don't ever forget that. Sammy nodded, something settling in him. I won't. I promise. That night changed something fundamental at the Sands, and gradually, in Las Vegas itself. Frank made it clear to the hotel management that what happened could never happen again. Anyone who used that kind of language, who showed that kind of hatred, was out, permanently. No exceptions. Other hotels started following the Sands' lead. Not out of enlightenment, but because Frank Sinatra had drawn a line, and Frank was too powerful to ignore. Slowly, painfully, Las Vegas began to change. Years later, in the 1980s, Sammy Davis Jr. gave an interview about his career. The interviewer asked him about the Rat Pack years. "Those were the best years of my life," Sammy said. "Not because of the fame or the money, because for the first time I felt like I truly belonged. Frank and Dean, they didn't just tolerate me being there. They wanted me there. They fought for me to be there." "What's the most important thing Frank ever did for you?" Sammy thought for a long moment. "There was a night in 1961, someone in the audience said something terrible. And Frank didn't just defend me. He made it clear that an attack on me was an attack on him. That's when I knew this wasn't just a professional relationship, this was family." Dean Martin, in his own interview years later, was asked about Frank's temper. "People always talked about Frank's temper like it was a bad thing, but I saw Frank use that temper to protect people, to stand up for what was right. That night with Sammy, Frank could have ignored it, could have let it slide, but he didn't, because Frank believed that if you see injustice and you have the power to stop it, you have an obligation to act." Frank Sinatra never talked publicly about that night. It wasn't his style to make speeches about tolerance or justice. Frank believed in actions, not words. But those who were there never forgot it. The audience members who saw Frank stand up to that heckler told the story for years about how the chairman of the board stopped a show to defend his friend, about how Frank Sinatra made it clear that some things mattered more than entertainment. The Rat Pack continued performing together for years after that night. They had their conflicts, their disagreements, their moments of tension, but the bond forged between Frank, Dean, and Sammy remained unbreakable because they'd been tested, and they'd proven that their friendship was real. Sammy Davis Jr. went on to have a legendary career. He performed for presidents, he broke barriers, he became an icon. But he always said that the most important moment of his career wasn't a performance or an award. It was standing on stage at the Sands Hotel in March 1961, vulnerable and hurt, and watching Frank Sinatra walk toward a bigot with calm, deadly certainty. "That night, Frank showed me something," Sammy said. "He showed me that I didn't have to fight alone, that there were people who would stand beside me, not behind me, beside me, as equals, as brothers, and that changed everything." The story of the Rat Pack is often told as a story of entertainment, of cool guys in tuxedos, smoking and drinking and making audiences laugh, and that's part of it. But the real story is deeper. It's about three men from different worlds who decided that friendship transcended the prejudices of their time, that talent deserved respect regardless of skin color, that human dignity was worth fighting for. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. didn't just perform together. They made a statement. Every time they walked on stage together, every time Frank introduced Sammy as his brother, every time Dean put his arm around Sammy's shoulders, they were saying something radical for 1961. They were saying that the old rules didn't matter, that people mattered. And on one night in March, when hatred tried to silence one of them, the other two stood up and said, "No, not here, not ever." That's not just entertainment history, that's American history. Three men using their platform, their power, and their friendship to push back against injustice, not with speeches or manifestos, but with simple, powerful action. The room went silent when that heckler shouted at Sammy. But it didn't stay silent. It erupted with applause, with support, with love, because Frank and Dean showed everyone in that room that there was another way, a better way. And that's the legacy of the Rat Pack. Not just the music or the movies or the legend, but the example they set, that friendship is stronger than hatred, that standing up for what's right matters more than staying comfortable, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is look someone in the eye and say, "You belong here, and I'll fight anyone who says otherwise." Frank Sinatra silenced that room not with his voice, but with his conviction. And in doing so, he gave Sammy Davis Jr. something no amount of talent or success could provide, the knowledge that he wasn't alone, that he had brothers who would walk through fire for him. That's what the Rat Pack really was, not just a group, a family that chose each other and protected each other and proved that love is stronger than hate.